5 pages and I've only given you the first 2. Imagine if you're the author of that paper and you receive this report. You'd be pretty unhappy. You'd be very upset. But these 2 reports that I've given you are real examples of real papers. Alright, we don't need to read through them all now. I just want to give them to you. You can read them later to see the sorts of comments that are made. Very typically, a report will make some general comments and then go through the manuscript line by line, refer to the line number and make a comment if there is an issue that needs to be addressed. So they are quite detailed. Alright, any questions or comments about those 2 reports? Or about editors and referees up to this point? You can see why I said that you can be excited one minute and very stressed the next.
What if the comments from referees have a conflict?
Okay.
One have positive, the other negative.
Alright, the question is what happens if the paper comes back from 2 referees? One says, great manuscript, publish, and the other said, a load of rubbish, reject. Well, the editor then has to have a look at what he or she might do at that point. They may send it to a 3rd referee or even a 4th referee to see if another person thinks that the paper is good or bad. There are all sorts of reasons why referees might send in a bad report. One is that they know who the writer is and may simply not like them. So they write a very critical report. And you, as an editor, you have to be very mindful that those sorts of things happen. The other thing the editor can do is send the manuscript to the editorial panel for the journal. So these are quite senior known people. If you have a look inside the cover of a lot of journals, you will see that there's an editorial advisory panel. Well, the editor will send a manuscript like that to that panel and get their comments back. They're senior, experienced people. They are there to look after the interests of the journal only. They're not interested in who the authors are or anything like that. And they will assess the paper. That's typically what happens where you have major controversies.
Usually this has been done before sending the comments back to the author.
Yes, correct. But the editor will often send a letter to the authors saying, I have received reports on your manuscript. I apologize for the delay, but I'm seeking some other input at this time. They won't say anything more, but they'll let you know that they haven't forgotten about you. All right, so how do you respond to all of this? Well, firstly, don't get upset or offended. You might want to go and punch the wall or kick the cat or go and have a beer or 3 beers, but don't get too upset. The referees are not normally attacking you as a person. They're looking at your science, they're looking at how you've written the paper, and that's what they're being critical of, not being critical of you. So it's not an attack on you. You might feel that, but it isn't. It's a critique of your paper. And you might, having received the comments, say, yeah, they're right. Why did I make that mistake? Why didn't I think of this? Yeah, I was always worried about those data. They've caught me out, so I have to accept that they're right. Typically what I recommend you do is get the referees' reports, read them, then put them aside for a couple of days. 1 or 2 days. Catch your breath, come back and then have another look at the comments. Remember, they are intended to be helpful. So read the comments carefully and have a look at your manuscript and make sure you understand the comments that are being made. Make sure you understand what you're being asked to do in making the changes that are being suggested. Alright, so take some time to do that. While you're doing that, highlight some of the comments that you may be struggling with. Or I don't really understand that. I'll just put that aside, I'll mark it, and then I'll come back to it later. If you've got some co-authors on the paper, your supervisor, your colleagues in the lab, make sure that they see the comments that you've received as the corresponding author. It's not just your responsibility. They've got their names on the paper. They have to work with you to address the comments that are being made. So share the paper with your co-authors or a trusted colleague if you're the sole author and want to talk to somebody about the comments that are being made. Even though you put those big criticisms aside, go ahead and make the changes, all the easy ones. Tidy up the spelling mistakes, reformat the paper if it's not formatted the right way, do all of the simple things. And where you need to, then start addressing the major things and rewrite sections as you're being required to do. All right? Critical comments that you receive are upsetting. Even though they're not targeted at you, as I've said, you will be upset. Critical comments upset you. But come to realise that nobody's ever completely right, nobody's ever completely wrong. The last 2 days we've looked at titles, we've looked at phrases, we've looked at words. You can think of alternative words, that's fine. You can think of an alternative title, that's fine. There's nothing absolutely right or wrong. So just realise that you might have had a referee that was having a bad day and they were just feeling very critical. Doesn't mean that they're right, but it does mean you need to think about the comments that they're making. You do need to address the comments that are made. You can't just ignore them. So you do need to do that, but make sure that in addressing the comments and rewriting things that you don't change the meaning that you originally intended. Be very careful not to change the meaning of a sentence by using a word that the referee suggested but you may not understand. Be very careful of not changing a meaning. When you go back, if you're going to go back to the editor with a revised manuscript, you need to show the editor that you've done everything you can to improve the manuscript and to respond to the referee's comments. And if the paper is rejected, it doesn't necessarily mean that the science is bad. It just might mean that the paper's not well written or that you have picked the wrong journal. Now in the handouts I've given you some examples of how you might respond to a series of comments. So in white we have the questions that have been raised by the referees or a referee, and in the orangey colour the response that you as an author might write back to the editor. Why was this cultivar mentioned in the discussion? Well, the authors felt it was important to point out to readers that this selection is an option to commercial production. So you're responding to the question with a very clear answer. You don't have to alter the text, you're just explaining why you had mention of that cultivar in the discussion. I would question whether the yields in the 3 years after planting are reflective of those of a mature planting. Are the plants mature by the 4th growing season? Now you can imagine if you're doing a trial on mango or durian, you've got juvenility factors, you've got transplant issues, you've got young trees. Perfectly fair question to ask. So you go back and say, although 3 years of data reported, production was already similar in the last 2 years of the study, and problems with suitability of these selections in this environment were already obvious. Again, you don't need to change the text, but you're responding to the referee's comment in an appropriate way. You may choose to change the text to make the point clearer, but you don't have to. One down here. This is an awkward phrase. Quote, have largely not proven to be released as cultivars, end quote. Fixed. Means rewritten, dealt with. Alright, so you've agreed with the referee and you've changed the wording. And so on. So you can have a look at those other examples, but you do need to go back to the editor point by point and respond to the issues that the referees have raised. Referee, if you've done that, the editor is likely to come back and say, I note that you've addressed all the comments. I'm pleased to advise that your manuscript is now accepted for publication. So you might have been upset by the comments, you've gone through and systematically addressed them, you've improved your manuscript, and you've got it accepted. That's a pretty neat outcome. Yes?
Could this feedback go back to the referees or just the editor?
Just goes back to the editor. It normally does not go back to the referees. The only thing that the referees might get is a statement from the editor as to whether the manuscript was finally selected or accepted or not. But I've refereed dozens of manuscripts and I don't know whether they were ever published or not in the end. I have no idea what the other referees said, but the editor manages that process. We could take a lot of time on this, so I'll go through it quite quickly. A number of things that you need to do in responding to the referees. One of the typical things that comes back is that you haven't really explained the aims of your study clearly enough. Remember at the end of the introduction, at the beginning of the discussion, you should be outlining the aims of your study, the objectives of your study, the hypotheses that you're testing. A lot of people don't do that very well at all. Referees will say that. I read the manuscript, but I didn't really know what the objectives of the study were. So if a referee says that to you, you need to include them or rewrite them to make sure that they are clear. I know that sounds obvious, but don't ignore the statement. It's important that everybody that reads your paper understands why you did the work. Ensure that those aims are consistent with and linked to experimental design and methods that you use, and that the discussion refers back to the aims. Remember the 6 points in the discussion? The first one was redefining the objective. So that's a pretty easy one to deal with. Having been on this course, you shouldn't make that mistake. The theoretical premise on which the work is based is challenged. In other words, you made some assumptions from the literature that there was a certain understanding that you were testing your work against. Well, you need to make sure that you are citing all the relevant published literature. And often this comment will come from a referee where you haven't cited his or her papers. And they might be a referee that's just published something that's really exciting and new and is challenging the old theories. And you haven't cited them. So they'll come back and often put the title of the paper and the journal and the page numbers in their report, saying it would be helpful if the authors referred to this publication. So make sure that you have covered the literature, that you're right up to date with all of the theories, and if there are contrasting theories, make sure you've got both sides of the argument covered. That you haven't explained your statistical methods or your experimental design adequately, or you've said one thing in the materials and methods and your results suggest that you used another form of analysis. We talked about that yesterday. Get it sorted out. And if there's an argument about whether the statistical method you used is appropriate or not, cite a paper where that same method was used as proof that others have done exactly what you've done and had it published and accepted. But if you have to, rewrite or put additional information in the manuscript. You've been asked to supply additional data. Well, defend the current set of data if you can, because in our fields of work you're unlikely to go back and do a whole lot more new experiments and prepare a whole lot more data. It takes years if you're dealing with horticultural crops. You don't have the time to do that. So defend the data that you've got. If you've got additional data and you're happy to include it in that manuscript, provide it. But you might just rewrite some sections to improve the justification of why you've gone ahead with the data set that you've got currently in the manuscript. That's a very difficult one. You're pretty well, particularly from theses, you're stuck with the data that you've got. So you need to make the best of it. You're asked to remove sections of information or sections of the discussion, perhaps because it's too long in the eyes of the referees. Well, if it doesn't alter the story and you're happy to remove some of the information, do so. Remember, you can't make somebody read your manuscript. If it's shorter, briefer, clearer, then they are more likely to read it. So I know it might have taken you a long time to write those paragraphs that you're being asked to remove, but just do it. Just remove them. If the story isn't changed by removing them. You might, though, want to rewrite some sections if you want to retain the text. Perhaps it's not clear enough, so rewrite it. Or go back to the editor and say, look, if I remove those paragraphs, the story won't be clear, so I'd prefer to leave them in. And you're likely to have that idea accepted. I think we've done enough of that. The sorts of examples that I've used are worth taking action on and resubmitting your paper to the editor if they have indicated that they will accept your manuscript back in a revised form. If they've rejected it, don't go back to the editor. If they've rejected it, look at the referee's comments, take notice of them, and deal with them before you submit to another journal. Why? The referees of the second journal are likely to find the same mistakes. The referees for the second journal may be the same people that were used by the first journal. We work in small fields, trust me. I have sent papers back to a journal saying, I've already read this manuscript, I rejected it, the authors have made no effort to improve it, I recommend rejection. Don't do that. Before you resubmit, take note of the referee's comments, make the improvements that you can, and then submit to another journal. If you find that you don't want to respond to a lot of the referee's comments, but the editor has said, I will accept the journal, the manuscript back, I'd recommend at that point you go to a new journal anyway, because the editor's already got some doubts about your work. It's a hard one to give you direct advice on, but if you're likely to finish up in an argument with the editor, pick another journal. Pick another journal. But don't resubmit unless you've tried to improve the manuscript. So when you do resubmit, make sure that the manuscript's fully reworked, that there are no spelling mistakes left, there are no style issues left to be dealt to, there are no paragraphs that are unclear, that you've dealt with all of that. Reply to all of the reviewers' comments in a constructive, positive way, and I've shown you how to do that. Send a formal letter to the editor summarising your position. Dear Sir or Madam, thank you for your previous letter and for the referee's reports that you provided. You're very professional and very nice. We have considered all the points raised, and I'm pleased to include a revised manuscript with this letter for your further consideration. And you include all the detailed responses that you've made to the referees, perhaps on separate pages, that go in with the letter and with your revised version. If necessary, go to an alternative journal. Whoops. And if you go to another journal, you're likely to add something like 3 months to the process, whereas if you go back to the original journal, it's probably more like 2 weeks. So it's worth sticking with the journal if you think you can deal with all the criticisms that have been raised. Any questions about referees, editors, journal selections? Okay, I suggest we take a 5-minute break. So stand up, breathe deeply, walk around the block. 5 minutes.